Here's some good news for 2026. The buzzword in federal IT and acquisition community will not be artificial intelligence. But don't worry, AI and all the things around it will continue to be a hot topic. For more on the federal IT and acquisition topics some experts say they'll be watching closely, Federal News Network's executive editor Jason Miller joins me with details from his annual survey. Jason, good to have you.
Always a pleasure, Terry.
So I have to ask, if AI is not the buzzword, what will be?
I talked to 7 different, former federal executives, people like Jonathan Albom, the former USDA CIO, now over at ServiceNow. I talked to folks like Nancy Seeger, who's over at Guidehouse, former IRS CIO. And I talked to some acquisition folks like Mike Hettinger, who spent time on the Hill, other folks who are kind of experts and who have watched this stuff closely. And what was interesting to me is of all when I say, okay, what's the big buzzword? If 2025 buzzword was cost savings and efficiencies, what do you think buzzword will be in 2026? And I got almost 7 different answers from 7 different people. So some folks said, like Matthew Cornelius from over at Workday, he goes, government-wide human resource transformation. Not surprising. It's a big play for Workday. But Melvin Brown, former OPM deputy CIO, talked to me about speed to capability and acquisition models spreading beyond DoD. I thought that was a really interesting one. Kevin Cummings, former Senate staffer, now over at Franklin Square Group, talked about fraud prevention. This idea of combating waste, fraud, and abuse, it's a perennial issue, but he just believes, based on what he's seen, whether it's the 8A program or what's the latest news from Minnesota, this administration will really go deeper on that. And then a couple people mentioned DOGE, right? Is it gone, but not really gone? But okay, what's this really going to mean as we head into 2026? And then finally, the last one I'll just point to is someone did mention AI, Jonathan Albom, as per mentioned, but not this idea of deploying AI, but really how to make it tangible to mission value. So a couple tidbits in there that of course people, you ask 7 questions, you get 8 answers, right, Terry?
Sounds like underneath all of that, though, is a technology backbone, modernizing technology or something like that. What are the big IT and acquisition initiatives those experts say they'll be watching closely?
A lot of them came back and said a lot of the things that happened in 2025, how that's going to continue to play out in 2026. But let me give you just a couple that I thought really stood out to me. Melvin Brown, again, former OPM deputy CIO, he brought up, hey, the idea of the cybersecurity maturity model certification, CMMC, this idea of the phased rollout. Does it become a quote unquote de facto barrier to entry, right? Because rollout is going to be a phase. It started in November, but really in 2026 is the first full year where they'll be enforceable from DoD. What will it have kind of impacts on protests, supply chains? How about smaller firms? Will they get crowded out or will they have some support? Kevin Cummings mentioned the Technology Modernization Fund, to your point of the infrastructure side. Okay, so right now, the authority for the TMF has expired. Current projects can continue along as long as there's money to support that, but no new projects. At the same time, we know that President Trump was a supporter of the TMF. He signed it into law under the MGT Act. Will they do something to renew it, or will they figure out a different path to get money for technology programs and projects? And then several people talked about the recently launched Tech Force effort from OPM. There was some news that OPM put out just at the end of December that talked about more than 25,000 people have already applied for the Tech Force. How many of them will get hired? I think OPM said they're initially going to start with 1,000, but how will that grow? How will that kind of catch on, and where those people will land in the agencies to, again, give them some support to help address some of the big technology challenges? And of course, you can always count on someone like Julie Dunn, former FAS commissioner, to dig deep into acquisition and talks about Title 41 acquisition reform. Now, you asked me, what is that? Well, this was a proposal in the House NDA that did not get into the Senate side, but really would increase some of the acquisition thresholds, micro purchase threshold, simplified acquisition threshold. How will that be used? And how will that also improve the way they buy cloud services? So I know there's a lot there, Terry, but those are just a few of the tidbits of things that they're going to be looking out for.
One of the other provisions that everybody was anticipating in the NDAA that didn't make it in was right to repair. Did anybody bring up that issue?
That did not come up in my survey, but I think that's part of this bigger discussion around the supply chain itself. And I think there is a lot of concerns about, okay, what will a lot of these changes, again, whether we're talking artificial intelligence, whether we talk about cloud, how does that impact the supply chain and the speed to capability trend that I think we're starting to see. How also will that be kind of that move out of DoD, get implemented in DoD first and then move into other agencies? So while right to repair was not a topic that popped up, I think it's going to be part of the bigger discussion that we've been having really since COVID around supply chain challenges.
One of the administration's big initiatives in 2025 was the Revolutionary FAR Overhaul, which I've now understood to be abbreviated RFO. While that is not finished yet, were there suggestions from the survey about what policies or regulations the administration ought to tackle next?
One of the big things about the FAR overhaul was, the FAR was built, it was developed over the last 40 years. It really is someone's never come in and said, hey, what don't we really need anymore? Hey, let's get the barnacles off the ship, if you will, right? The bottom of the ship. So I asked a very similar question. What's a long-standing policy that's been overlooked, that really underappreciated, that could really impact? And I got some really interesting answers. Matt Cornelius, for instance, says IT accessibility, really Section 508. It's been more than 50 years or almost 50 years since really that policy was set in place. It's had some updates over the years, but really when was the last time Congress or any administration stepped back and said, well, how do we make sure that technology is accessible for people with disabilities? So I thought that was a really interesting one. Another one comes from Kevin Cummings, and he talked about commercialization, right? We know the administration put out an executive order in early 2025, really pressing folks on commercialization. But what does that really mean when you talk about how companies come through the reseller market, or they need the third-party accreditation like CMMC, like FedRAMP? And what does that mean for other people who want to use more OTAs, other transaction agreements? Does that really introduce this idea of new and different companies into the federal market? So I think that's another area that I think that could really relook at that again. And then one other one I will offer is that we don't hear a lot about these days, but I think we will hear more about, is the security clearance system. Okay, they've made some progress, but Nancy Seeger from Guidehouse, former IRS CIO, talked about that this is still slowing down the ability of people to get on contracts to help vendors can help agencies meet their needs. It still takes 6 to 12 months. There's been some staffing challenges, adjudication challenges. How can the government really look at portability ideas? How can they look at other things that could improve the talent retention, reduce costs? So I think that's another area where I think they'd like to see the government step in and say, how can we redo this?
One of the concerns that I think some folks have is that it took so much energy to get the FAR out in the way it is now, and there's still another big task ahead to actually write the rules and get through the rulemaking process. Any concern that that's going to shift the thinkers away from creating new policy initiatives?
I think with any administration, they know their time is short. If they really want to make progress, they can't come in and have 10, 12, 15 different initiatives that all make a little progress. They got to have a few initiatives that make a lot of progress. So to your point, Terry, I think there's a lot of focus from this administration on RFO and to say, hey, we have to make this work, because otherwise people will go back to what they know and not really change that culture. So while I think the FAR overhaul will continue to be a huge priority for this administration, and especially as a big story for 2025 that I don't think last time we talked, we mentioned, they actually have an OFPP administrator for only the second time in 8 years, and one that's been Senate confirmed, who's permanent, Kevin Rhodes. So I think having that person in place really can help kind of push forward that. At the same time, some of these other areas that I talked to, again, security clearance is a good one, is driven by other parts of OMB, other parts of DOD that really, you're not kind of robbing Peter to pay Paul when it comes to resources and people and time. So I think that's why I think it's important to say, what can we make the most progress on, and do we have those resources behind it? And again, that's something that every administration has to kind of balance out.
Jason, you've given us the highlights from your survey. I want to know what you personally are watching for federal IT and acquisition that these folks didn't mention.
Once again, I really had to think deep, because every time I kind of thought of something, I said, oh, well, nope, that got mentioned. Or, oh, what about this? Nope, that got mentioned. The one thing that came to me and that we only got a little brief mention is small business changes and challenges. And I'll specifically call out the Small Business Administration's audit of the 8A socioeconomic program. This is going to come out in early January, potentially February. The trickle-down effect on the small business community, I'm really interested to see what happens. We know that several agencies have really cut their small business offices to the bone, down to one people, like the Air Force, Treasury, that we've heard rumor, HHS. What is that going to mean for the promotion, the support of small businesses? Every administration comes in, Democrat, Republican, it doesn't matter. Terry, they always say the same thing. Small businesses are the backbone of our nation. Yet they do things that you go, well, that doesn't seem like you're very supportive of small businesses. And I think, a lot of this rhetoric around the problems with the 8A program, what is that going to mean for women-owned business? What is that going to mean for service-disabled veteran-owned businesses? What's that trickle-down effect? So I think there may be none, there may be big, we don't know. But again, when you talk about what you're going to be looking for in 2026, that audit could really launch a really big challenge for a lot of small businesses in the federal sector.
That's Federal News Network's executive editor, Jason Miller. Jason, thanks for helping us set our sights for the coming year.
It's going to be an exciting one. And we didn't even mention, Terry, 6G. That's going to save that for another time, but always my pleasure.
You can find his story at federalnewsnetwork.com.